Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Wednesday, 6th September. It will be sunny all day with highs of 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise, it will be at 6:11 a.m. and sunset at 7:29 p.m. We are on the 37th day of the Warsaw Uprising and another district falls to the Germans. How does that happen, Alina?
Yeah, Powiśle falls today. I've been kind of alluding to that quite a bit really over the past couple of days. But yes, today Powiśle is taken and defeated. The Germans are attacking the Home Army positions from the east, the north and the south. It is accompanied by heavy bombardment from the air, from artillery. The insurgents are more or less, they're outmanned, outgunned, and they just can't hold the district. It's just impossible for them to do so. The power plant falls. That's completely gone. You know, we spoke about that yesterday. No longer is the power plant functioning, yet the insurgents have found ways around that, which is quite interesting. If you haven't listened to yesterday's episode, go ahead back and have a listen to that, really. Also, the civilians are still being evacuated and the insurgents decide to retreat to Śródmieście, Północ, so the northern part of Midtown. So the other thing that happens today is also the Church of the Holy Cross. We talked about that on the 23rd, where the insurgents actually managed to capture it alongside the headquarters for the Blue Police and the failed Warsaw University action. So 2 pluses, 1 minus. That this time the Germans, they managed to capture it. The insurgents held out for about 14 days, and it's on September the 4th and the 5th where they massively bomb the church. They took the ruins away from the insurgents. And it's today, on this day, where they decide to send in 2 remote-controlled Goliaths. We've spoken about those before, those tiny little remote-controlled tanks. Send 2 of those into the church, and the explosion more or less destroys the entrance to the church, the facade, the vault, and the building more or less collapsed in on itself. Also, what happened is the figure of Jesus, the one that stands with the cross. If anybody's been to the church, you'll be able to see that falls over. So if anybody sees photographs of Jesus lying in the middle of the street, then you know that this happens after the 6th of September. If you go to the church, you can still see the bomb damage, and you can see the damage on the statue, you can see the damage on the facade as well. It's very interesting. The other thing that happens today is the death of a very well-known Jewish fighter, Henryk Lederman. I think I might have mentioned him before. Just a little bit of background on Henryk. He ended up in the ghetto with his wife and his child, and before the ghetto uprising, he hid them in a bunker. And he went to fight. He was part of the Jewish Combat Organization. After a few days of fighting, he managed to get back to the bunker where his family was, and the whole house was completely demolished. He spent the whole night digging the bunker, and it just turned out to be completely empty. He never knew what happened to his wife and child. Most likely they were deported and sent to Treblinka. After the ghetto had been mostly burnt down, he tried to escape out of the sewers with 8 of his companions, and then the Germans threw grenades down the sewers. He was wounded in the leg, and he never found his companions, he never found his friends. So he ended up wandering the sewers. It turns out he was still in the ghetto, even though he was lost. He crawled back into the ruins looking for something to eat, and he survived for a couple more weeks before he decided to go back into the sewers and then finally managed to make it out onto the Aryan side. He found his Polish contacts, his Polish friends. He asked for help, and they managed to hide him in one of the underground and one of the resistance arsenals, where they had a load of weapons hidden away, ready for the uprising, or a uprising that would eventually happen. So what had happened? The location was betrayed. He was arrested, and he ended up in Powiśle prison. We've spoken about that before. He underwent severe torture. He never gave anything up. And finally, eventually, he was sent to Gęsiówka camp. We talked about that on the 5th of August, the liberation. And he was one of those people who was liberated. He was liberated from Gęsiówka prison on the 5th by the Home Army. He then decided to join his fellow Poles to fight against the Germans in the Warsaw Uprising. But because he knew the sewer system so well, he ended up doing that. He ended up working in the sewers, and he saved many lives, and he helped many insurgents and civilians escape, especially from the old town. And then he fought in Śródmieście, in the city centre, and then he fought in Powiśle. And this is why I mention him today, is that he is seen for the last time in Powiśle in a hospital because he was seriously wounded in the stomach, and it's most likely that it was de Levanga and his brigade that entered the hospital and murdered him alongside many other heavily wounded insurgents. And it's today that he dies. And the Jewish contribution, Polish Jews, any of the Jews that were liberated from Gęsiówka, Jews that were hiding in the Aryan side. My favourite human being, Alina, for example, was also Jewish. You know, we need to remember that their contribution was also important. So my final bit today is the Alfa Laval Hospital and the murder of the insurgents there. Now, I want to talk specifically about Father Czartoryski. He was originally caught up in the Warsaw Uprising on the 1st of August. He was on his way to a dentist appointment, and then he got caught up in OUW. And then he ended up joining the insurgents in Powiśle, in 3rd Group Konrad, which is my grandfather's grouping, because their priest hadn't arrived and they needed a priest for the battalion, for the group. So he decided to stay and he volunteered his services. Why am I talking about Father Czartoryski? Well, it's by the end of this evening that this whole Powiśle area is occupied by the Germans. As the Germans advance, de Lewanga's brigade is right behind them. And Father Czartoryski is left at the hospital, Alfa Laval Hospital, with a group of 11 seriously wounded insurgents. One of them was a civilian. Now, the one thing I want to add is that before the Alfa Laval Hospital was taken over, my grandfather's two very close friends, two fellow platoon comrades, were in the hospital. One had been wounded in the leg, and the other, I'm not quite sure what had happened to him. So I'm going to read a quote from Mielewski, codename Max. And he states, "When the time came to evacuate, suddenly Złomicz appeared." Złomicz is my grandfather. Złomicz appeared, as always, cheerful and smiling. He forced us to leave the hospital. It turned out later that he had saved our lives. He found me a cane, and we left. Złomicz constantly had us in tow, even though he had so much more to carry. He found us something to drink. All that time we were under his care. So what my grandfather did is he went in the hospital, dragged his two friends out, threw one over his shoulder and gave a cane to the other and more or less helped them into the Midtown area. So my grandfather, lunatic or saviour, I don't know, I'll let you guys make up your mind there, but he saved his two friends from this massacre that is about to happen at Alfa Laval Hospital. Anyway, back to what happened actually on this day. So it's around 12 p.m, midday. The SS have occupied Smolikowskiego Street, which is where Alfa Laval Hospital is. They enter from the southern part of the street, and Father Michał didn't want to leave the wounded insurgents behind. He'd stayed. And what de Lewanga's brigade did was they entered the hospital, they pulled out Father Czartoryski, they threw in a bunch of grenades into the hospital where they exploded and killed the insurgents that were left behind, and then pulled out Father Czartoryski, and alongside him pulled out another 30 civilians from the building across the street and murdered all of them. The reason we know this happened is one of the people that was part of this execution, part of this murder, was a civilian, survived, was shot and managed to crawl away. Later on, all the bodies, including Father Czartoryski, were doused with gasoline and they were burnt. So Father Czartoryski doesn't actually have a grave. We don't know where he is. And it will be today, it's on this day that I will be heading out to church to lay flowers and to commemorate these 11 seriously injured insurgents, Father Czartoryski, and the 30 civilians that were murdered alongside him at the barricade on ulica Smolikowskiego. And Eleonora Elżbieta Kasznicka, she's got a couple of words to say about Father Czartoryski, so she'll tell you a little bit more about his story.
The Germans came and told us to gather and leave. Father Michał was asked to dress up as a civilian, but he said he would never remove his habit because he was a Dominican priest and would stay with the wounded. He knew what awaited him, because the Germans said they would be killed. Father Michał gave us absolution. We left and he stayed. I see Father Michał, already blessed, sitting between the beds. There were 11 boys there, and he started to say the rosary loudly. These boys were so terribly nervous. It was obvious that death was waiting for them, and they couldn't move. Their friends left, and they stayed. This reassured them that a strong man, Father Michał, who was a relatively young man, stayed with them and would be with them until the end. It was a great attitude of his, and of course, they were killed in a terrible way.
So Alfa Laval is not the only hospital to be targeted today on this day, and Claire's going to tell us a little bit more about what's going on in the Śródmieście Midtown area of Warsaw.
Well, I feel like every time I've mentioned hospitals, I've been saying how they are generally in basements and cellars, which isn't always the case. And of course, as the Germans take more of the ground in Warsaw, there is less and less places for hospitals to be set up. So they are now also in established buildings. And on the 6th of September, several hospitals are hit in the Midtown area of Warsaw, which, if anyone knows Warsaw, is nowadays the Vauxhall area. So this area comes under very heavy fire from German artillery. This is the Nebelwerfer, which we mentioned previously, the rocket launchers, which are a classic piece of kit that the Germans use in just about every engagement in the Second World War. And they are incredibly powerful. And today they hit the hospital on one of the main streets in this Midtown area, and 120 people are injured immediately. So there is a whole lot of wounded casualties, too many for the hospital to be able to cope with. Several of them are left lying on the floors as the first floor of that hospital building was evacuated. But the building is soon catches fire and the fire spreads very rapidly. So again, it's still late summer, it's very dry, there is dust, broken wood everywhere. Fire really is, very rapid here, and it quickly cuts off access to the upper floors of the hospital. And it's just, there are horrific scenes. I don't want to be gratuitous about it, but, patients are fearing that they are going to lose their lives in an inferno. Some of them decide to try to escape, to jump from the windows, landing on the pavements down below. There is a story of one young boy who's severely burnt, and he leapt from the first floor of the hospital. He was badly wounded on landing, and he died a few days later. Some of the nurses in this hospital, they had to be forcibly restrained from going up the stairs to the floor above to try and rescue people. And the estimates are that between 60 and 80 wounded were burnt alive in the hospital in the conflagration. And German shells then also set fire to another hospital further down, and again, a number of fatalities. The building wasn't so badly destroyed, and that evening it was occupied by German troops. But for the next 3 days, really, patients are being still moved from these burnt out hospitals. But there's nowhere for them to go. Warsaw is running out of shelter as well. So some of these injured are forced to camp without food in a nearby garden, or, the remains of a garden, where they are tended as best it's possible at this point. But, horrific situation. Sometimes the segues come quite easily, but after you've given a story like that, it's good to just pause and think about it for a minute, really. And there's a lot more horror that we could discuss, but I think it's probably best to go. Roger, you've been looking at the international press, so let's just step back and have a look at what's being said internationally.
Yeah, I mean, if that was the case, I mean, von den Bach is a curious chap, like so many of these, particularly in command of the SS. They're often, I mean, not always, but often very educated and sort of cultured individuals. And von den Bach himself, had his, I think I've said before that his proper name was Erich von den Bach Zalewski, and he had Polish blood, he had Polish forebears, which he was very keen to, play down. So he tended to drop the Zalewski. He tended to just call himself Erich von den Bach. Now, I think, from memory, he also spoke a bit of Polish because of that. So perhaps he did actually go and speak to some of them. I think that, perhaps it was possible. But yeah, as you say, I mean, what he said and how he conducted himself is another question. He's a curious fellow. He looked like a provincial accountant. He's kind of quite plump with little wire-rimmed glasses. So he doesn't look like your sort of stereotypical, committer of atrocities in World War II. He looks more like a sort of bookkeeper.
He looks like Himmler, doesn't he?
Yeah, very much like a fat Himmler, actually. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us on day 37 of the Warsaw Uprising, and we will see you tomorrow for day 38. Hopefully the days are correct and I'm not leading you astray with some random amount of numbers. But do send us your questions, please do that. Also, this is a note for my uncle, hopefully he is listening, and I know he's been talking to my mother, and just to let you know, I will be talking about grandma or my great-grandmother a little bit later, not quite yet, in a couple of weeks' time. You'll all find out why. Unless you know me and follow me on social media, then you already know why I'm going to be talking about my great-grandmother, but I will get to it, I promise. And in this episode you've got granddad to talk about, or granddad to listen about. Anyway, thank you so much. Remember, leave us a review. We need those reviews. Thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow.